The saddle had been broken for 3 years. Theron Galt knew this, because he was the one who had taken it down from the mare the morning after Calla died, when the cinch-ring had already been pulling through the sweat-softened leather for weeks, and he had not fixed it, because fixing things had stopped mattering for a while. He had hung it on the third hook in the tack room, the one nearest the back wall where the light did not quite reach in the afternoon, and he had left it there. 3 years of dust and forgetting and the slow curl of neglected leather drying in mountain air. So, when he walked into the barn on a Tuesday morning in October of 1881 and found the saddle on the workbench, cleaned and oiled and repaired, with stitching so fine it looked like it had come out of a saddlery in St. Two, Louis Theron Galt stood very still for a long time. The cinch-ring had been reset. Not simply reattached, but recessed into a new panel of skirting leather that had been cut and shaped and fitted so precisely that the join was nearly invisible unless you tilted it against the light and knew where to look. The tree, which had cracked along the cantle the day the mare spooked and went sideways into a fence post on Calla's last ride, had been splinted with a strip of ash wood, glued and bound with rawhide that had been soaked and dried so it contracted tight as a band of iron. The worn latigo had been replaced with one cut from good leather, hand-punched and oiled to match the original color so closely that it seemed to have aged alongside everything else. The whole saddle gleamed under the morning light like something that had just drawn its first breath. Theron picked it up. He turned it in his hands. He ran his thumb along the stitching and felt the evenness of it. Every hole punched at the same distance from the last, the thread waxed and pulled to a tension that spoke of hundreds, maybe thousands, of saddles before this one. This was not the work of a man who knew a few things about leather. This was the work of someone who understood it the way a fiddler understands a tune. Not just the mechanics, but the feel, the grain, the places where it wanted to give and where it needed to hold. He set the saddle down and looked around the barn, and then he began to notice the bridle hanging by the door, the one with the cracked brow band he had been meaning to replace since July. It was whole, stitched with the same careful hand, the same quiet precision. The feed bin lid that had lost its hinge and been propped shut with a stone for the better part of 4 months, it swung freely now on a new pin that had been carved from hardwood and fitted without a sound. Theron walked the length of the barn slowly. A split board in the rear wall had been patched from the inside with timber cut so cleanly he had to press his fingers to the seam to confirm it was there. A cracked bucket, sealed with pine resin and beeswax. 3 tack hooks, all flush and tight again. Someone had been in his barn not once, several times, from the look of it, working in the thin hours before dawn, when the only company was the mice in the hayloft and the barn owl that roosted in the high beams and regarded everything below with the tolerant disapproval of minor royalty. Theron walked out into the cold morning light and found his foreman Pike Noonan leaning against the corral fence with a cup of coffee and the posture of a man who had successfully avoided the first obligation of the day. "Who fixed the saddle in the barn?" Theron asked. Pike looked at him with a mild confusion of someone who has not been inside a barn by choice in recent memory. "Which saddle?" "Calla's saddle. Someone rebuilt it, replaced the latigo, reset the cinch ring, and splinted the tree. Did you do it?" Pike's face answered before his mouth could. "No, sir. Did Harlan?" "Harlan cut himself opening a feed sack last week. I would not trust the man with a halter, let alone a saddle." Theron looked past Pike, out toward the south end of the property where Cairn Creek bent around the cottonwoods and the land sloped gently toward the tree line. And there, at the edge of his property where the creek grass grew tall and the fence posts ended, he saw her. She was sitting on a flat stone by the water, with her back to the ranch, very still, the way a person sits when they have learned not to be noticed, and have made a careful practice of it. A woman. Dark hair tied back under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen more weather than most people see in a lifetime. A coat that did not fit her properly, too broad in the shoulders, The kind of coat you inherit from someone who was bigger than you, or buy from a bin at a trading post because it is the one you can afford. She had a small bundle beside her and what looked like a bedroll, and nothing else. "How long has she been there?" Theron asked. Pike glanced over his shoulder with the mild interest of a man being shown a fence post. "Few days, maybe 4. She came up from the creek road heading south. 4 days. She has not bothered a thing, just sits out there, gathers firewood from the far bank, keeps to herself." Darnell mentioned her when he brought the supply load on Thursday, called her a vagrant. Darnell calls anything without a saddle and a hat a vagrant. Well, Pike shrugged, she has got the hat. Theron stood there for a moment, looking at the woman by the creek and then back at the barn behind him, and then at the woman again. 4 days. The repairs had started about 4 days ago. He did the arithmetic of it in his head, slowly, carefully, letting each piece settle against the next before reaching for the sum. "That woman fixed my saddle," he said. Pike made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same territory. "A woman fixed that saddle. That is the finest leather work I have seen in this valley, and I have been here 11 years. I did not ask what you have seen. I said she did it." Pike looked at Theron, then back at the woman by the creek, reassessing her the way you reassess a landscape when someone tells you there is gold in it. But the reassessment did not take. She was too small, too quiet, too much of whatever Pike Noonan's world did not have a place for. "If you say so," Pike said, and went back to his coffee. Theron did not go back to his coffee. He stood at the fence, and he looked at his ranch, and he thought about the things he did not like to think about in the mornings, because the mornings were hard enough already. Cairn Creek Ranch. 640 acres of Bitterroot Valley grassland pressed against the western slope of the range, running from the creek bottom in the south to the timber ridge in the north, where the elk came down in winter and the wind came down all year. He had built it with Calla, 20 years of building, the two of them turning a one-room cabin and a handshake from a land office clerk into something that breathed and fed and held. At its best, the ranch had run 50 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and enough hay to winter all of it without borrowing. At its best, it had been the kind of place that made a man stand in his doorway at dusk and feel that this was what he had been put here to do. That had been a long time ago. Calla had died in the spring of 1878, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the slow, merciless way that a fever sometimes takes a person when the nearest doctor is 2 days' ride and the snow will not stop falling. Theron had sat beside her for 11 days. On the 12th morning he had walked out to the barn and stood there for an hour without moving, and the world had continued around him as though nothing had changed, which was the cruelest part. Their daughter, Lenore, had come home from Missoula for the burial and stayed 3 weeks and then gone back to her husband and her life in the city, which Theron understood and did not blame her for, and also could not forgive, which he knew was not fair and did not know how to fix. She wrote letters. He read them. He did not always write back. His sister Dorrit had arrived that same autumn, uninvited and unmovable, with 2 trunks and a cast-iron skillet, and the settled conviction that her younger brother was not going to eat himself into the grave on her watch. Dorrit was 67 years old and had never married, not for lack of offers, but for lack of anyone who met her standards, which were considerable. She kept the house. She kept the meals. She kept Theron alive in the literal and most necessary sense of the word, and she did it with the brisk efficiency of a woman who regarded sentiment as a luxury and competence as a religion. But Dorrit could not fix the ranch. Nobody could, or at least nobody Theron had found. He had 2 hands besides Pike, Harlan Doss, who was young and willing and about as useful as a paper hammer, and old Marvell, who had been with the ranch since 1870 and knew more about cattle than any man in the valley, but whose knees had stopped cooperating sometime around 1879 and whose mornings now began with a negotiation between what needed doing, what his body would allow. The fence line was falling apart in 3 places. The barn roof leaked on the north side when the wind pushed the rain sideways, which in the Bitterroot Valley was most of the time. The herd was down to 28 head from a high of 50. Not from disease or disaster, but from the slow, grinding arithmetic of a ranch that is losing more than it is making. Feed cost rising, beef prices falling, equipment wearing out faster than it could be replaced. And there was Pemper, Josiah Pemper, who owned the Blackstone outfit on the other side of the ridge, 3,000 acres and growing. He bought land the way some men buy drinks, casually, frequently, and with the assumption that everyone was selling, whether they knew it yet or not. He had approached Theron twice in the past 2 years, with offers that were just generous enough to sound reasonable and just low enough to be insulting. Both times Theron had said no. The second time, Dorrit had been standing on the porch behind him holding a broom in a manner that suggested she had considered its alternative uses. But Pemper was patient. Men like Josiah Pemper did not need to push. They just needed to wait. They watched the fence line sag and the herd thin, and the winters get longer. And they waited for the moment when tired became surrender. Theron knew this. He knew it in his own hands, which were still strong, but moved slower now and ached in the mornings in places they had not ached 5 years ago. That was the thought he carried every morning. When he opened the ledger book that Calla had started in 1862, the careful columns and the honest numbers that said what he did not want to hear. The ranch was not dying. That would have been easier somehow. A clear thing with a clear ending. It was just slowly becoming less than it needed to be. Theron finished his coffee. He set the cup on the fence post. He looked at the woman sitting by the creek, still as a stone, and he made a decision that he would spend the rest of the morning trying to talk himself out of, which was a sign that it was probably the right one. He walked down to the creek. She heard him coming. He could tell, because her shoulders shifted slightly, not a flinch, just the subtle adjustment of someone who is aware of an approach and has decided to remain where she is. She did not turn around until he was 10 paces away, and when she did, she stood up. Not quickly, not nervously. She rose the way a person rises when they have been expecting something and want to meet it on their feet. Up close, she was younger than he had guessed from the fence, mid-20s maybe, though the skin around her eyes had the particular tightness of someone who has spent too many seasons squinting into wind and sun. Her hands were what Theron noticed. They were not soft. They were not delicate. They were the hands of someone who had worked with rope and leather and wire for years, scarred across the knuckles. A callus on the right thumb in the exact place where a stitching awl sits when you are pulling thread through heavy hide. She looked at him without speaking, waiting. A person who has been in this moment before and knows that the first words belong to the other person. "You've fixed my saddle," Theron said. It was not a question. Her eyes confirmed it anyway. A small movement, steady.
"I fixed a few things,"
she said. Her voice was quiet and clear, without apology, without the eager upward tilt of someone trying to sell something. Just a statement of fact, plain and unadorned. That saddle belonged to my wife. Something changed in her face, not much. A softening around the eyes, the kind of shift that happens when a person understands that they have touched something they did not know was tender. "I could tell it mattered to someone," she said. The leather was too good to let it go, and the break in the tree was clean enough to save. I could not walk past it. Theron looked at her for a long moment. "What is your name?" "Sorrel. Sorrel Vane." "Where did you learn to work leather like that?" "Sorrel Vane." "My father was a saddle maker, Prosper Vane. He had a shop outside of Cheyenne for 22 years. I apprenticed under him from the time I could hold a needle. By the time I was 14, I was doing half the commissions myself, though the customers did not know it. He put his name on everything." "Why did you leave Cheyenne?" "He died." She said it simply, the way people say things that hurt too much, to dress up with extra words. 2 years ago. I tried to keep the shop open. Nobody would commission work from a woman. Not for saddles. Not for anything that mattered. She paused and looked past Theron toward the barn, the corral, and the cattle visible in the far pasture, and he recognized the look. The look of a person taking stock, reading a place the way a doctor reads a face, seeing what is well and what is not. Your fence line on the north ridge is sagging between the 4th and 7th posts, she said. The wire has stretched and the posts are leaning east, which means the ground is soft from a water runoff you are not channeling properly. Your hay shed has a beam that is cracked on the load-bearing side, and it will not survive a heavy snowfall. You have a mare in that corral. She nodded toward the enclosure where Flint, Theron's gray, stood with her ears pinned at the world in general, who is favoring her left foreleg, and from the way she is standing, I would guess it is an abscess in the hoof, not a tendon problem, which means it is fixable if someone cleans it and packs it within the next day or two before it gets worse. She looked back at Theron. I have been turned away from every ranch between here and the Yellowstone. 9 ranches in 14 months. Not because I could not do the work, because they could not see past the fact that I am a woman doing it. So I stopped asking, and started fixing things in the dark instead. I fix what I can see that needs fixing. It is the only language I have that anyone listens to. The morning was still. The creek moved over its stones. Somewhere behind them, up at the corral, Flint stamped and blew in the way that difficult horses do when they want the world to know they have opinions. Theron looked at this woman. Sorrel Vane, 25 years old, maybe less, standing at the edge of his property in a coat that did not fit her, with hands that could rebuild a saddle in the dark, and eyes that had already cataloged half the failures of his ranch in 4 days of watching from a creek bank. 9 ranches had looked at her and seen nothing worth keeping. He thought about that. He thought about the saddle on the workbench, Kala's saddle, the one he had not been able to touch for 3 years. Fixed now, made whole by a stranger who had not asked permission and had not asked for payment, and had done it simply because she could not walk past broken leather and let it stay. He thought about the fence line and the hay shed and the mare's hoof and the 28 head of cattle that needed more than Pike Noonan's coffee breaks and Harlan's good intentions and old Marvell's ruined knees. And he thought about Josiah Pemper waiting on the other side of the ridge. "Come up to the house," Theron said. Sorrel looked at him. Something careful moved behind her eyes. Not hope exactly. Something more guarded than hope. The watchful thing that lives in a person who has learned not to reach for what might be pulled away. "Why?" she asked. "Because my sister is making breakfast," Theron said, "and she makes enough for an army whether there is one or not. And because I have some questions. And because that mare has not let a human being touch her left side in 2 years, and I would like to see if you are as good as that saddle says you are." He turned and walked back toward the house without waiting for an answer, which was either a gesture of confidence or a gamble, and Theron was not entirely sure which. Behind him, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be a decision rather than a reflex, Sorrel Vane picked up her bundle, picked up her bedroll, and followed. Dora Galt was standing at the kitchen window when they came up the path. She had been standing there since Theron walked down to the creek, because Dorrit missed nothing that happened on this property, and very little that happened outside of it. And she had long ago decided that observation was the first and most important duty of anyone who intended to keep things from falling apart. She watched her brother walk back toward the house. She watched the woman follow him at a distance of about 10 paces, close enough to be following, far enough to be careful. She watched the way the woman moved. Not the shuffling walk of someone beaten down by the road, and not the eager trot of someone chasing a meal. Deliberate, aware. The walk of a person who notices the ground beneath her feet and the direction of the wind and the position of every living thing within earshot, because noticing these things has at some point become necessary for survival. Dorrit dried her hands on her apron and had 3 opinions before the front door opened. Theron came in first. "We have a guest for breakfast," he said. "I can see that." Sorrel stepped inside and stopped just past the threshold. She removed her hat. Her eyes moved across the room quickly, not the darting assessment of someone looking for what she could take, but the quiet inventory of a person who wants to understand where she is before she speaks. She saw the kitchen, the stove, the table set for three, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the photograph on the mantel of a woman with dark eyes and a straight back sitting beside a younger version of Theron. She looked at that photograph for 1 second longer than everything else. Then she looked at Dorrit. "Thank you for having me in, ma'am," Sorrel said. "I am sorry to arrive without notice." Dorrit looked at her directly, without decoration. She had spent 67 years forming judgments about people, and most of those judgments were correct, and the ones that were not had cost her dearly enough that she no longer apologized for being cautious. "Sit down," Dorrit said. "There are eggs." Breakfast was quiet. Sorrel ate the way a hungry person eats when they are trying not to show it. Small bites taken at careful intervals, the fork set down between each one. She did not take seconds without being offered. She did not speak unless spoken to. She complimented the biscuits once, simply without flattery, and Dorrit noted this and said nothing. When Sorrel had finished and gone outside to wash her hands at the pump, Dorrit set down her coffee cup with the particular precision that Theron had learned over a lifetime to recognize as the opening of a conversation he was not going to enjoy. "No," Dorrit said. "I have not asked anything yet. You are about to ask if that woman can stay and work this ranch. And the answer is no." Theron sat back. "You saw the saddle." "I saw the saddle. It is fine work. That does not mean the person who did it belongs on this property." She identified problems with the fence line, the hay shed, and Flint's hoof in under a minute, standing at the creek. Dorrit's mouth tightened. "Theron, we have had strangers before. Do you remember the man from Helena who said he could break horses? He broke one. The wrong way. It had to be put down. Do you remember the boy who came through in '79, charming as Sunday, who left with Cala's good bridle and $40 from the kitchen tin? I remember. Then you remember why we do not take people in off the road based on one morning of good impressions. This is not the same. It is always the same. They are helpful at first. They are always helpful at first. And then one morning you wake up and something is gone that you cannot replace." She paused. Her voice, when she continued, was quieter. Not softer. Dorrit did not do soft, but quieter, which from her meant the same thing. "And she is a woman, Theron, alone, on the road. I am not saying that is her fault. I am saying there is a story there, and we do not know what it is, and this ranch cannot absorb another person's trouble right now. We have enough of our own." Theron looked at his hands on the table. He knew his sister was right in the way that cautious people are often right, correctly identifying every risk and none of the possibilities. He also knew that the saddle sitting in the barn had been rebuilt by hands that understood their work the way Cala had understood hers, with a kind of bone-deep knowledge that you cannot fake and cannot learn in a season. But Dorrit's voice had the weight of experience behind it, and experience in the Bitterroot Valley was not a thing you argued with lightly. The word no was settling over the kitchen like a verdict, quiet and heavy, the kind of no that does not need to be shouted because it has gravity on its side. And that was when they heard the sound. It came from the corral. Not a sound that belonged to the ordinary morning vocabulary of a working ranch. This was wood splintering, a sharp crack followed by a second crack, and then the high, panicked whinny of a horse in pain. A sound that went through Theron's chest like a blade, because he knew that voice. He had known it for 9 years. Flint. He was out of his chair before the whinny finished, through the kitchen door, across the porch, and he saw it. The corral fence, the section on the east side that had been leaning for months, and that he had braced with a timber that was itself half-rotten, had given way. 2 rails were shattered on the ground. And Flint, the gray mare, Cala's mare, was through the gap and running. She was running badly. favoring the left foreleg the way Sorrel had described. But fear had overridden the pain, and she was moving in a ragged, lopsided gallop toward the north ridge, toward the timber, toward the rocky ground above the tree line, where a lame horse on an abscessed hoof could stumble into a gopher hole or a crevice and shatter a leg. And that would be the end of everything. Pike was at the far end of the property. Harlan was somewhere in the hay shed. Old Marvell was standing at the barn door, watching Flint run with the expression of a man who knows exactly what is happening and knows his body will not let him do a thing about it. Theron started toward the remaining horses in the south paddock, already calculating the time it would take to saddle one, and already knowing it was too much time, already feeling the mathematics of the situation closing against him. Flint had a 200-yard head start, and the kind of wild, frightened energy that a cornered animal produces when pain and panic merge into a single blind imperative to run. And then he saw Sorrel. She was already past the broken fence, not running, which was the first thing that surprised him. Walking fast, with long measured strides, but walking, moving across the open ground toward the north ridge at an angle, not directly behind Flint, but off to the left, cutting toward the tree line on a path that would intersect the mare's trajectory about 300 yards ahead. She had taken off her coat. She was carrying something in her right hand, and it took Theron a moment to realize it was the lead rope that had been hanging on the corral post, the one she must have picked up as she passed through the gap in the fence without breaking stride. "She will never catch that horse on foot," Pike said. He had appeared from somewhere, coffee still in hand, with the resigned tone of a man watching an inevitability unfold. Theron said nothing. He watched. Sorrel did not try to catch the horse. That was what Theron understood first, and Pike did not understand at all. She was not chasing Flint. She was reading her. Watching the mare's movement, the angle of her head, the way her ears rotated between the pain in her hoof and the open ground ahead and the tree line to the right. Sorrel was watching for the patterns inside the chaos, the places where fear turns into hesitation, and hesitation turns into a decision. Flint reached the edge of the timber and stopped, not because she wanted to, but because the trees were thick and the ground was rocky, and even a panicked horse has a limit to what it will run into blind. She stood there, sides heaving, left foreleg held slightly off the ground, head high, nostrils wide. Sorrel stopped too, about 40 yards from the mare. She stood still. Completely, absolutely still, in a way that was not the absence of movement but the presence of patience, something offered rather than withheld. A minute passed. Flint's head turned toward her. The mare's ears came forward, then back, then forward again. Sorrel took one step. Then she waited. Another minute. Another step. The distance between them closed, not in yards but in fractions, each fraction earned by silence. Theron watched from the fence. Dorrit had come out onto the porch. Old Marvell had not moved from the barn door. Even Pike had gone quiet, which was notable. At 20 yards, Sorrel began to speak. Theron could not hear the words. He was not sure they were words at all, just a low, steady sound, a current of voice that moved across the space between the woman and the horse like something you could almost touch. Flint's head dropped an inch. Her weight shifted. The left foreleg came forward slightly, and she flinched, and Sorrel stopped speaking, and waited, and then began again. At 10 yards, the mare blew out a long breath. The kind of breath that a horse gives when something inside it lets go, when the wire-tight spring of fear loosens just enough to allow something else in. Trust, or the beginning of trust, or the memory of what trust used to feel like. Sorrel closed the last distance in a straight line, her hand extended, palm up, and offering nothing except the hand itself. Flint's nose came down to it. She breathed across Sorrel's fingers. Then she breathed again. And then Sorrel's other hand came up slowly, so slowly that the movement was barely visible, and she placed it on the mare's neck. Flint did not move. The left side. The side that nobody had touched in 2 years. Sorrel's hand rested on it, and the mare stood still, and something that Theron could not name passed through the cold October air between them, old and simple, and entirely beyond the reach of explanation. Sorrel clipped the lead rope to Flint's halter. Then she knelt. She lifted the left foreleg, and the mare let her, which alone was enough to make old Marvel take his hat off, though he would not have been able to tell you why. Sorrel examined the hoof with her fingers, pressing gently along the sole, finding the heat, finding the center of the swelling. She reached into her belt and produced a small folding knife, the kind that saddle makers carry, and she opened the abscess with a single clean cut that was fast enough to be kind and precise enough to be safe. The mare flinched once, then stood still. Sorrel held the hoof and let it drain, and while she held it, she talked to the horse in that same low, steady voice, and the horse listened. When she was done, she tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her own shirt, packed the wound with a handful of clean moss she pulled from the base of a nearby pine, and wrapped it tight. Not a permanent fix. A field dressing, done with the materials at hand, done correctly, and without hesitation, the way a person works when they have done this many times before, and will do it many times again. She stood up, she gathered the lead rope, and she walked Flint back down the ridge toward the ranch, the mare following beside her at a slow, even walk, the left foreleg already moving better, the head low and calm, the wild, frantic energy of 30 minutes ago replaced by something that looked remarkably like relief. They came through the broken section of fence together. Sorrel led Flint to the barn, tied her loosely to the post outside, and looked up. Theron was standing at the corral. Dorrit was on the porch. Pike was by the fence with his coffee growing cold. Old Marvell was still at the barn door, his hat in his hands, looking at Sorrel with an expression that Theron had not seen on the old man's face in a very long time. It was respect, not the grudging, qualified respect that comes with conditions attached, just respect, plain and whole. The abscess was deep, but clean, Sorrel said, addressing Theron, not breathing hard, not making a performance of composure, simply composed, the way a person is, when they have done the most important thing they know how to do, and do not need applause for it. I drained it and packed it. She will need a proper poultice by this evening, and the wrapping changed twice a day for a week. The hoof is sound underneath. She will be fine. She paused and looked at the broken fence. Your corral rails are pine. They should be oak or at least juniper. Pine dries out and splinters under stress. I can replace the broken section today if you have timber. And I would like to walk your full fence line tomorrow to see what else is close to failing, because if this section went, there are others that will follow before the first hard freeze. She looked at Theron. Then she looked at Dorrit on the porch, and she waited. The morning was still. The creek moved over its stones. Flint stood at the barn post with her head low and her ears soft, and her left foreleg resting easier than it had in weeks, and she did not look at any of the people who had lived with her for 9 years. She looked at Sorrel. Theron gave her the room at the back of the barn. It was not much, a narrow space, walled off from the main structure with rough-cut boards, furnished with a straw mattress on a plank frame, a single wool blanket that smelled of cedar and age, and a washstand with a chipped basin, and a mirror that had gone cloudy in one corner. There was a nail on the back of the door for a coat, and a small window that looked out toward the creek where the cottonwoods turned the afternoon light green and gold. It is not comfortable, Theron said, standing in the doorway. Sorrel set her bedroll on the mattress and her bundle on the floor, and looked around the room the way a person looks at something they have not had in a long time. Not with gratitude, exactly, with recognition. The recognition of a space that is hers, even temporarily, even conditionally, even if the conditions have not yet been spoken. It has walls and a roof, and it does not move, she said. That is more than I have had in 14 months. Supper is at 6. Dorrit does not hold it. Yes, sir. And do not call me sir. My name is Theron. Sir is what people call you when they are planning to leave. Something shifted at the corner of Searle's mouth, not quite a smile. The ghost of one, passing through on its way to somewhere else. Theron, she said. He left her there. On his way back to the house, he passed old Marvell, still standing at the barn door as though the morning's events had rearranged something in his understanding of the world, and he was waiting for everything else to catch up. That girl is the real thing, Marvell said quietly. I know, Theron said. Your sister does not think so. I know that too. Marvell put his hat back on. Your sister is wrong about many things. She is usually right about people. This time, she is wrong. Theron said nothing. He walked back to the house. Through the kitchen window he could see Dorrit washing the breakfast dishes with the focused energy of a woman who is cleaning something, because she cannot control everything else. She did not look up when he came in. She did not need to. The silence between them said what needed saying, and what it said was, I do not agree with you, and I am not finished disagreeing, but I will hold my tongue for now because you are my brother, and this is your ranch, and I have said my piece. Theron sat down at the table and opened the ledger and looked at the numbers and did not see them. In the weeks that followed, Sorrel Vane proved herself in the way that certain people prove themselves, not with announcements or displays, but with the steady accumulating evidence of work done well and done unprompted. She replaced the broken corral rails that first afternoon, not with pine as she had said. She walked the creek bank until she found a stand of juniper deadfall, dragged 4 lengths back to the ranch by herself, and cut and fitted them with a draw knife and a level eye. By evening, the section she had rebuilt was stronger than anything else in the corral, and Pike Noonan, walking past it on his way to supper, stopped and looked at it and said nothing, which was Pike's version of high praise. She tended Flint's hoof twice a day, every day, for 9 days. Each morning and each evening she knelt beside the gray mare and unwrapped the poultice and cleaned the wound and repacked it, and wrapped it again with the patient, unself-conscious focus of a person performing a task that is not a chore but a conversation. Flint stood for her every time. On the 4th day, the mare lowered her head and rested her muzzle on Sorrel's shoulder while she worked, and old Marvell, who was watching from the barn door as he always seemed to be watching from the barn door, turned away and blew his nose and said it was the cold air. By the end of the 2nd week, Flint was sound. By the end of the 3rd, she was moving with a freedom and ease that Theron had not seen since Calla was alive. Sorrel rode her one morning in the south pasture just a walk, just a slow circuit of the fence line, and Theron was standing at the kitchen window with his coffee when he saw it, and had to set the cup down because his hand was not steady. It was not that Sorrel rode the way Calla had ridden. It was not resemblance. It was something deeper than that, something that had to do with the quality of attention between horse and rider, a particular kind of listening that is not about technique but about respect. Calla had it. This woman had it. And seeing it again, after 3 years of its absence, was like hearing a familiar song in a country where you thought no one spoke your language. He did not mention this to Dorrit. He did not need to. Dorrit had seen it from the porch. Sorrel walked the entire fence line in her first week, all 640 acres of perimeter, every post, every strand of wire, every gate and hinge and brace. She carried pliers and a coil of wire and a small hammer, and she came back each evening with a report that she delivered to Theron at supper, calmly, specifically, without softening the facts. The Northridge section was the worst. 14 posts, leaning or broken, wire down in 6 places. She fixed what she could as she went. What she could not fix alone, she marked with strips of cloth tied to the wire, so they could return with the wagon and proper timber. It was on the 3rd day of walking the fence that she found something that made her stop. She was on the eastern boundary, where Galt Land met Pemper's Blackstone Range, examining a post that had snapped at the base. She crouched down and looked at the break for a long time. Then she looked at the next post, and the one after that. She took out her knife and scraped at the base of the fourth post, just above the ground line, and held the blade up to the light. She did not say anything about what she found. Not that evening, not the next day, not the day after that. She simply continued walking the fence, and if her attention on the eastern sections was more deliberate than elsewhere, nobody noticed, except Marvell. But Marvell said nothing either. At supper, Sorrel sat at the table and asked questions. Where does the creek run highest in spring? Which pastures hold their grass in a dry August? How many calves did the herd throw last spring, and how many survived the first month? The questions of someone building knowledge inside her mind, learning the land by paying attention to what it tells you, when you are quiet enough to hear it. Theron answered her, each evening a little more. And Dorrit listened, and her silence changed quality over the weeks. It shifted from the hard silence of disapproval to something more complicated. The silence of a woman watching her own certainty become less certain. The shift began, if it could be traced to a single moment, on the morning Dorrit came out to hang the wash and found at the clothesline post, which had been leaning at a 15-degree angle for 2 years, and which she had propped with a rock and accepted as one of those things that would never be properly fixed, was standing straight. New base, new hole, tamped and leveled and braced with gravel. She stood there looking at it with a bedsheet in her hands and an expression that was impossible to read. She did not thank Sorrel. She did not mention it. But that evening, at supper, there was pie, which there had not been on a weekday and longer than Theron could remember, and the slice that found its way to Sorrel's plate was not smaller than the others. Pike Noonan was a different matter. Pike had worked at Cairn Creek for 11 years, which in his mind had earned him a position of authority that his actual work did not quite support. He was not a bad man. He was simply someone who had found a level of performance that kept him employed and saw no reason to exceed it. And the arrival of someone who worked at twice his pace and 3 times his skill was not a development he welcomed. He made his feelings known through small erosions. A comment at the corral about how some people fix things that do not need fixing. A habit of referring to Sorrel in the third person when she was standing 5 feet away. A tendency to leave his tools in places where she would need to move them. Sorrel did not react. She did not complain. She simply continued working, and the gap between what she accomplished and what Pike accomplished widened daily into a canyon that everyone could see and no one mentioned, until the morning Pike left a gate open. He would say later that he forgot, and perhaps he did, but the result was that 6 head of cattle wandered through into the creek bottom, and it took Sorrel 3 hours on Flint to bring them back, and when she rode past Pike on her way to the corral with the last of them, she stopped the horse and looked down at him and said very quietly, "If you have a problem with me, say it to my face. I have been talked around and worked against by better men than you, and I am still here. But if you leave a gate open on this ranch again, I will not be the one explaining it to Theron." Pike said nothing. He looked at the ground. He looked at the horse. He looked at Sorrel Vane sitting straight in the saddle with the easy authority of someone who has earned the right to say what she just said, and something rearranged itself behind his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but the recognition that the ground had shifted beneath him and he had not noticed until now. He did not leave any more gates open. The first real cold came in the 2nd week of November. Snow on the peaks, frost on the creek bank in the mornings. The kind of sharp, bright days where the air feels thin and the mountains look close enough to touch. Sorrel had been at Cairn Creek for 5 weeks. That evening, the 4 of them were sitting after supper. Theron with the ledger, Dorrit with her mending, Marvell with his pipe, and Sorrel in the straight-backed chair by the window that had become hers by the unspoken process through which certain seats become certain people's in a household. The fire was going. The wind was pressing at the glass the way it does in the Bitterroot when winter is making up its mind. Dorrit set down her needle. She looked at Sorrel for a long moment, the kind of look that Dorrit gave when she had decided to say something she had been carrying for a while, and was finished carrying it. "Your father," Dorrit said, "the saddle maker. What happened when he died?" The room shifted. Not visibly. The fire still moved. The wind still pushed. But the quality of the silence changed. The way it changes when a conversation steps from the everyday into the personal, from the safe ground into the territory where things are tender and true. Sorrel was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "He got sick in the winter of '79, she said. "He had always been strong. The kind of man who worked 12-hour days and never complained about anything except the price of good leather, which he believed was a personal injustice directed specifically at him." A warmth passed through her expression. A memory, surfacing, tender and painful. At the same time, the sickness took 3 months. I ran the shop while he was in bed, made the saddles, did the fittings, handled the customers. Most of them did not know he was sick. They thought he was still making the work. I let them think it. She paused. "When he died, I went to the bank to transfer the accounts. The clerk looked at me and said, 'We will need a male signatory.' I told him I had been making every saddle out of that shop for 4 years. He said that was not relevant to the banking requirements of the territory." Theron's hand tightened around his pen. He did not speak. "There was a man in town. Droff Dalcott. He owned the livery and the feed store and a few other things. He came to see me 2 days after the funeral. He said he admired my father's work and he wanted to preserve the shop's legacy. He offered to buy the business for $600. The shop, the tools, the inventory, the name, everything my father had built in 22 years. $600. "And you told him no," Dorrit said. "I told him no. So he went to the bank, and because the accounts were still in my father's name, and I could not transfer them without a male signatory, and I did not have one, Dalcott made an arrangement. I do not know the details of it. I only know that 2 weeks later, the bank called the loan on the property, and the amount they demanded was more than I could pay, and Dalcott bought the building at auction for less than what he had originally offered me." The fire crackled. "I had my tools," Sorrel said. "I had my father's awl and his stitching clamp and his draw knife and the patterns he had made over 22 years. I had those because I carried them out of the shop the night before the auction, and I had $40. And that was all." She looked at her hands, the scarred knuckles, and the callus on the right thumb. "I went to every ranch I could find between Cheyenne and the Yellowstone. 14 months, 9 ranches. I showed them what I could do. I fixed tack, mended harness, rebuilt gear that their own men had been botching for years. And every one of them said the same thing in different words. 'We do not hire women for this work.'" She looked up from her hands and into the fire. "They did not say I was not good enough. Not one of them said that. They said I was a woman, as though those two things were the same." The room was quiet. The wind moved outside. Marvel's pipe had gone out, and he had not relit it. Dorrit picked up her mending. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Theron thought she would not speak. Then she said without looking up from her needle, "The world is full of people who would rather let a thing stay broken than admit that the person who can fix it does not look the way they expected." Sorrel looked at her. "Most people are blind that way," Dorrit said. "There is no shame in being invisible to blind people. The shame belongs to them." A release passed through Sorrel's face. Not tears. Something deeper than tears. The look of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long that they had forgotten it was there, and someone has just named it, and the naming itself is a kind of relief. Theron closed the ledger. He did not have anything to add. Dorrit had said it. She usually did. The weeks turned. November deepened into the kind of cold that tests everything, metal and wood and bone and will. Sorrel worked through it. She finished the North Ridge fence line, all 14 posts replaced, and the water channel diverted with a drainage trench she dug herself over 3 days in frozen ground. She reinforced the hayshed beam with a brace she designed and built from materials she found on the property, and when the first heavy snow came in the last week of the month, and the beam held without a sound, Theron stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at her work and thought of all the things he should say, and said none of them. Pemper came on a Saturday in December. He came late in the afternoon, when the light was going flat and the cold was settling in for the night, which was not an accident. Men like Josiah Pemper chose their moments the way card players choose their hands, selecting for advantage. He brought 2 men this time, not the hired gun type, but something more subtle. A lawyer from Helena in a good wool coat and clean boots, and a stocky man with a calm face, who Theron recognized as Breck Loomis, the county assessor, whose presence at a property visit was never a good sign. They rode up to the gate. Pemper dismounted. The other 2 stayed in their saddles. Theron was in the barn and came out when he heard the horses. "Harold," Pemper said, then corrected himself with a smile that did not reach anywhere useful. "Theron, forgive me." Long Day. He knew Theron's name. The mistake was deliberate, the kind of small diminishment that men like Pemper use to remind you that you are not important enough to remember correctly. "Josiah," Theron said. "I have brought Mr. Driscoll, who handles my legal affairs, and I believe you know Breck." Pemper gestured at the 2 men on horseback. "I wanted to come in person because I respect you, Theron. I respect what you and Calla built here, and I have a new offer that I think reflects that respect." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. $2,000 cash for the land, the structures, and the remaining stock. Mr. Driscoll has drawn up the papers. Breck is here as a witness. We could settle this tonight, and you could be in Missoula with your daughter by Christmas. Theron looked at the document. He did not take it. "The answer has not changed, Josiah. The circumstances have changed. Your herd is down to 28 head. Your fence line has been failing for 2 years. You have 1 hand who can still ride, and 2 who cannot find the business end of a post driver." Pemper's tone was patient, gentle, the tone of a man explaining gravity to someone who insists on jumping. "I am not trying to take anything from you. I am trying to offer you a way out before the winter takes the choice away." "The fence line is repaired," said a voice from behind the barn. Pemper looked past Theron. Sorrel was coming around the corner of the building, walking without hurry, her hands at her sides. Flint was following her, untied, trailing behind her like a dog, which was something the mayor had started doing in the last 2 weeks and which no one could explain and everyone had stopped trying to. Pemper looked at her with the blank, momentary assessment of a man who has encountered something outside his categories. "And who is this?" "Sorrel Vane. I manage operations at Cairn Creek." Pemper's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked at Theron. Theron said nothing. "Miss Vane," Pemper said, with the exaggerated courtesy that is itself a form of dismissal. "This is a private matter between myself and Mr. Galt. Mr. Galt's private matters are my professional concern, and I would like to discuss a professional concern of my own." She stopped at the fence. She was calm, not the performed calm of someone controlling their fear, but the actual, settled calm of a person who has thought carefully about this moment and has decided exactly how it will go. "When I walked the eastern fence line in October," Sorrel said, "I found something interesting. 11 posts had been damaged, not by weather, not by cattle. The bases had been scored with a draw knife, cut about 1/3 of the way through, just deep enough that a hard freeze or a strong wind would do the rest. The cuts were angled to look like natural splitting if you did not know what you were looking at. The air changed. Pemper's face did not move, but something behind it went very still. I also found wire that had been cut and twisted back together so it would look corroded. 8 sections on the eastern boundary, all on the Galt side, all in places where a fence failure would allow cattle to drift onto Blackstone land." She reached into her coat and produced a small cloth bundle. She unrolled it on the fence post. Inside were 4 short pieces of wire and a section of scored wood. "I have been keeping these since October." I have notes on every section, every post, every cut, with dates and locations. I also have a letter drafted to the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena, describing a pattern of deliberate property damage on land belonging to Theron Galt, carried out from the Blackstone side of the boundary. She looked at Pemper, then at Driscoll the lawyer, then at Breck Loomis the assessor, whose face had gone the particular shade of gray that a man's face goes when he realizes he has been standing on the wrong side of a line he did not know was there.
"Mr. Pemper," Sorrel said, "$2,000 is not an offer. It is an insult to 20 years of work.
And if any person sets foot on Gauntland to damage so much as a fence post again, that letter goes to Helena, and the next conversation you have will not be with me." A long silence followed. The wind came down off the Bitterroot Peaks, carrying the smell of snow and pine and the cold mineral scent of the creek. Pemper looked at Sorrel for a long time, recalculating something he thought he had already solved. Then he looked at Theron, and at the barn, and at Flint, who was standing at Sorrel's shoulder with her ears flat and her eyes on Pemper with the focused hostility of a horse who has decided who her people are and who is not among them. "This is not finished," Pemper said. "Yes, it is," Sorrel said. "You just have not accepted it yet." Pemper took the document from where he had set it on the fence post. He folded it and put it back in his coat. He looked at Driscoll. He looked at Loomis. Neither of them met his eyes. He mounted his horse. The three of them rode back down the road, and the sound of their hooves faded into the cold air until there was nothing left but the wind and the creek and the settling dark. Sorrel stood at the gate until the silence was complete. Then she turned. Theron was standing on the porch. Dorrit was in the doorway behind him. Old Marvel was at the barn, leaning on the frame the way he always did. And even Pike Noonan was there, standing by the corral with his hat in his hands, looking at Sorrel with an expression that was no longer anything less than respect. Theron came down off the porch. He walked to where Sorrel was standing. He stopped and looked at her, and the look on his face was one that Dorrit, watching from the doorway, had not seen in 3 years. It was the look he used to give Kea when she had done something that reminded him why he had chosen this life. Not admiration. Something deeper. Recognition. "Come inside," he said. That evening, Theron Galt did something he had not done since the night Calla died. He went to the back of the pantry, to the high shelf where the dust was thick and undisturbed, and he took down a bottle. Not the everyday whiskey, the one that lived by the stove and came out for cold nights and aching joints. This was the other one. The one Calla had bought in Missoula the year they paid off the land. The one she had said was for occasions that deserved to be marked, and that had been opened exactly 3 times in 20 years. The birth of Lenore. The year they hit 50 head. The night Calla told him she was sick. He set 3 glasses on the table. Sorrel looked at the glasses. One at Theron's place, one at hers, one at the seat where Dorrit always sat. 3 glasses, set out before anyone asked, before anyone had to remind him. Dorrit appeared in the doorway. She looked at the table. She looked at her brother. Wells, and her expression shifted, because the fact that he had set out 3 without hesitation told her what was about to happen, and that he already considered this settled before the words were spoken. She sat down. Theron poured. "You found the fence damage weeks ago," Theron said. "You did not tell me. I wanted to be sure, and I wanted to have the evidence before I said anything. A claim without proof is just a complaint. You could have taken that evidence and used it yourself, gone to the marshal, claimed a finder's interest, and used it as leverage for your own position." Sorrel looked at him. "That is not why I stayed." Theron turned his glass in his hands. He was quiet for a time. The fire moved. "I have a lawyer in Missoula. Good woman. Lenore found her for me last year, though I did not think I would need her." He paused. "I have been thinking about something since October, since I came down to the barn and found that saddle." Sorrel waited. "I want to make you an offer, a real one, not the kind that Josiah Pemper makes, Work this ranch through the winter. Full authority over operations. Same as you have been doing, but official. Documented. In the spring, if it is still working, and if you still want to stay, I will draw up a partnership agreement. 30% of the operation, not wages. Ownership. He looked at her. In 10 years, when I cannot work this land anymore, and that day is coming whether I want it or not, you would have the first right to buy the remaining share at a fair price. Appraised value. Not a fire sale, not a favor. A fair price. The room was very quiet. Why? Sorrel asked. Because you are the best hand I have ever seen on this ranch, and I am including myself and Kala in that count. Because you stood at that fence tonight with evidence that could have ended Josiah Pemper, and you did not use it for yourself. You used it for this place. He stopped. He started again, and his voice was rougher. And because this land deserves someone who sees it, not someone who looks at it and sees numbers or acreage or what it can be sold for. Someone who sees the fence line and the water and the hayshed beam and the gray mare with the bad hoof, and sees that all of those things are the same thing, that they are the ranch, and that the ranch is worth saving. Sorrel looked at the glass in front of her. She did not pick it up immediately. Her hands were on the table, the scarred knuckles, the calloused thumb, and the hands that had rebuilt a dead woman's saddle in the dark because she could not walk past broken leather and leave it broken. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. She did not look away. She did not try to hide it. She let it sit there, honest and open, the way a true thing sits when you let it be true. I will earn it, she said. I know you will. That is the only reason I am asking. Dorrit lifted her glass. She held it for a moment, looking at Sorrel across the table, and her face, that sharp and guarded face that had held its skepticism like a shield for 5 weeks, did something that Theron had rarely seen it do. It softened. Well, Dorrit said, now that that is settled, I suppose someone should tell Pike he is no longer the senior hand, and I would like to be present when it happens. And for the first time since she had walked up a creek bank with a bedroll and nothing else, Sorrel Vane laughed. Pemper did not come back. Not because of the whiskey or the evening or the warmth of the kitchen, though those things mattered. He did not come back because in January Sorrel rode to Helena with the evidence and the documentation and the letter, and she filed it. Not as a threat, as a fact. The territorial marshal opened an inquiry. Breck Loomis, the assessor, resigned his position 2 weeks later without public explanation. Driscoll, the lawyer, sent a letter to Theron's attorney in Missoula, formally withdrawing any and all offers related to the Cairn Creek property. Josiah Pemper sold the eastern portion of his Blackstone holdings in March to a family from Oregon who had no interest in expansion and every interest in being left alone. The fence line between the two properties was not damaged again. The winter was hard as Theron had predicted. 6 weeks of cold that froze the creek solid and kept the cattle in the near pasture. Sorrel worked through it, and Theron worked beside her, and old Marvel did what his knees permitted, and Pike Noonan, who had undergone a transformation so gradual that he himself might not have noticed it, began arriving at the barn before Sorrel for the first time in his 11-year career. He did not match her pace, but he stopped pretending that the pace did not matter, and that was enough. By the time March came and the first green appeared on the south pasture and the creek ran free again under the last of the ice, something had settled at Cairn Creek Ranch that had not been there since the spring of '78. Not the absence of grief. Theron still sat some evenings with the photograph on the mantel and said nothing, and Dorrit still found him there sometimes and sat beside him without speaking. That would always be there. Grief does not leave a house. It learns to live alongside other things, to step aside when the living need the room, but the other things were there now. The sound of the barn door opening before dawn. The sound of Flint nickering when she heard Sorrel's boots on the gravel. The sound of supper at 6, where the conversation now ran long and ranged wide across the land and the seasons and plans that assumed a future, which was itself a kind of revolution in a house that had spent 3 years looking only at the past. On the first warm evening in April, Theron found Sorrel in the barn. She was not working. She was sitting on the bench beside the tack wall, and in her lap was Kala's saddle, and she was running a cloth along the leather with the slow, attentive care of a person tending something precious. He sat down beside her. "I want you to have it," he said. Sorrel's hands stopped moving. She looked at him. "The saddle, it is yours. Kala would have wanted it used, not hung on a hook. And you are the one who brought it back." Sorrel looked at the saddle. She ran her thumb along the stitching. She had done in the dark, the even holes, the waxed thread, the place where the old leather met the new, and the join was nearly invisible. "I did not fix it to keep it," she said. "I know. That is why I want you to have it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once. She held the saddle in her lap and she did not say anything else, and the silence between them was not the silence of things left unsaid, but the silence of things understood. Dorrit appeared at the barn door. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, and she looked at the two of them sitting on the bench in the late afternoon light, and she said, "I have been thinking." "Always dangerous," Theron said. "I have been thinking about why nobody saw her." She nodded at Sorrel. 9 ranches, 14 months, good hands, good work, and nobody saw it." She paused. "It is not because they were foolish, those ranchers. Most of them probably were not. It is because people only see what they have already decided is possible. They decided a woman could not do this work, and after that it did not matter what she did. The decision came first. The scene came second, and by then it was too late, because you cannot see what you have already decided is not there." She looked at Sorrel. "The measure of a place worth staying in is not whether it is comfortable or profitable or safe. It is whether the people in it are willing to see what is actually in front of them, even when it does not look the way they expect it." She straightened up. "I did not see you at first either," she said. "I want you to know that. I was wrong, and I am not a woman who says that easily, and I will not be saying it again, so I suggest you remember it." Sorrel looked at her. "I will remember it." "Good. Supper is in 20 minutes. I made pie." She turned and walked back toward the house. Theron watched her go and shook his head slowly the way a man does when someone he has known his entire life still manages to surprise him. They sat for a while longer, the two of them, in the barn that smelled of hay and leather, and the warmth of horses settling in for the evening. Through the open door they could see the south pasture, green now with the first new grass, and the fence line running straight and strong along the boundary, and the creek catching the late light as it moved over its stones. Flint stood in the corral with her head over the rail, watching the mountains, her gray coat lit amber by the falling sun. Sorrel held the saddle in her lap and looked out at the land she had first seen from a flat stone by the creek, sitting still, being invisible, and fixing things in the dark because it was the only language anyone would listen to. She was not invisible now. She was not sitting still, either. Or rather, she was, but it was a different kind of stillness, not the stillness of someone who has learned to disappear, the stillness of someone who has arrived. "I wrote to someone," she said. "A woman I knew in Cheyenne, leather worker. She trained under a harness maker in St. Joseph. She is good, better than good." Theron looked at her. "I told her there might be work here if she wanted it. If we could use another pair of hands." Theron looked at the pasture, at the cattle moving through the new grass, at the fence line, straight and solid, at the barn roof that did not leak, and the hayshed beam that held, and the corral rails that were juniper now and would not splinter in the cold. "I think we could use another pair of hands," he said. Sorrel nodded. She set the saddle gently on the bench beside her and stood and walked to the barn door and looked out at the evening. The Bitterroot Range held its snow on the high peaks against a sky that was going from blue to gold to the deep clear violet that comes just before the stars. The creek moved, The cottonwoods were budding. Somewhere Marvel's pipe smoke drifted across the yard, and from the kitchen came the sound of Dorrit setting the table, and from the corral came the sound of Flint breathing, slow and even and calm. Sorrel stood in the doorway of a barn that was whole, on a ranch that was mending, wearing a coat that fit her now, because Dorrit had taken it in at the shoulders one evening without comment. 5 months ago she had walked up a creek road with a bedroll and a bundle of tools and the settled certainty that the world would continue to look through her the way it always had. She had been wrong about that. And being wrong, for the first time in a long time, felt like the best thing that had ever happened to her. You do not always know the moment when the invisible becomes seen. Sometimes you only know it looking back, standing in a doorway in the April light, and holding a saddle someone gave you because you fixed it in the dark. But it happens, not loudly, not with announcements or fanfare. It happens the way morning happens, slowly, and then all at once, until the whole world is lit.